when we go out and talk to folks, and we spend a great deal of time out in the community talking to the people we work for, our bosses here in the 7th District and beyond, is this idea of how difficult it is, especially for folks who are transitioning from their starter home to the next level home and trying to move forward. And one of the things that we've come to realize that if we can find a way to allow folks to utilize some of the equity within their homes, use some of that equity in turn to help give them some tax relief as well as to also use that to buttress their homes and make them better. We know the economic multiplier when it comes to the real estate, especially the home construction, home building, home buying industry. That multiplier is significant, not just on the direct jobs and direct economic output that's associated with it, but all the ancillary stuff that goes along with it as well. And I think if we can do that, that economic generator has always been proven over the course of history to move people forward. You get a stake of your own piece of the American dream, but you're also putting folks to work who in turn are going to be there because that sort of moves our economy forward. And for me, it's like utilizing our tax code in a sensible and reasonable way to address not just affordability, but focus it and intently focus it on the group of middle class folks in New Jersey who've always been the backbone of our state. So that's our objective. It's not a brand new initiative, a brand new idea. It's some stuff that we've worked on and seen from other states. Congressman Tim Ryan, actually, out of Ohio, was doing something similar on the federal level. So we believe imitation is the highest form of flattery in that regard. So we wanted to try and find a way to do something to make New Jersey more affordable. As we know, that's a great challenge.
Sir, some of the other things that you're involved in on that particular front.
So affordability is something that's always at the forefront of our mind and the things we work on here, whether it's the stuff we've done on the prescription drug issue, which is something our phone rings off the hook about a lot, and we hear a lot about trying to find ways to lessen that burden on individuals, because as we say all the time, you shouldn't go to the poorhouse just because you got sick. And medicine is such a necessary thing that we shouldn't be in a situation where it's one of the greatest countries in the world, perhaps the greatest in the world in my opinion. Our quality of healthcare, which is great, the cost of it is exorbitantly high when you compare it to other industrialized nations all across this globe. And we look at the price point on prescription drugs. A pill for a certain prescription drug in America can be 3, 4, 5, sometimes upwards of 10 or 20 times higher than in other developed countries as well. And that for me is a big problem. And broadly, it's something the federal government needs to address. But if the federal government is not going to step in and do that, why should New Jerseyans? New Jerseyans always have to bear the brunt of this issue. So what we've tried to do, whether that's through our prescription affordability task force and board we're setting up, whether it's through the works we're trying to do on bulk purchasing, we want to be able to use not just New Jersey's buying power, but our influence as the medicine cabinet of our nation to try and change public policy and public perception in that regard. That for me is one of the cornerstones of the things that are part of our affordability agenda that we're working on.
So much happening simultaneously. I don't know where to begin with the next question, but I would ask you this, because we're working against a federal political backdrop. We're in the middle of it right now, and a key issue being debated is in fact healthcare coverage. The front runner, based certainly on what happened last night, Joe Biden, advocates a public option. His opponent advocates Medicare for all. Where do you stand, and where do you see the connectivity with the state legislative process, back to your initial point?
Right. So I think right now with all of us looking at especially what we're seeing on the coronavirus and its spread, I think we're hard pressed to sit back and determine that we should not find a way to make sure that every American has access to affordable quality health care. That's where we have to begin. The differential between where Senator Sanders and Senator Biden are in trying to come to that point is probably not as expansive as many pundits want us to believe, because I believe at their heart both believe in that purpose. The idea is, how do we get to that finish line? Now, if putting the political hat on, if you're sitting there and you sit back and you think, if we have a Senate that is controlled by the Republican Party, which frankly over the last 3 years under our current president has tried to dismantle healthcare, has done it aggressively through the courts, have tried through legislation to dismantle healthcare, I think they've put a marker in as to where they stand. So any public policy in which we're doing, and this may be the legislative guy and me talking, it almost doesn't matter if you don't have a legislature that can work with you to deliver it. And if we have a system and a process whereas we don't have a Democratic Senate and a Democratic House, then whether that's President Sanders or President Biden, if the Democrats were to win, those initiatives are going to have a tough time coming to fruition. So for me, maybe it's a little bit of being the pragmatic person that I am. For me, it's trying to make sure who is going to get us to the finish line of victory, and more importantly, who puts us in the best position to have a Congress that will allow us to move these initiatives forward. And I believe that is the objective, at least that I use as a metric to make a determination of who I personally will be supporting. And I'd ask my fellow citizens to use that metric as well, because the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and public policy, so much of it that's really good, oftentimes get left on the cutting room floor because it hasn't made its way through the legislative process. We have to have a congressional body that's going to allow us to achieve that goal, that every citizen in this country will be able to have accessible, affordable, quality health care.
Do you believe, Senator, that Sanders is a bridge too far in that regard? Do you think that, listen, you occupy a battleground county. We were talking earlier about how this county actually has been a front line. Do you believe that your colleague Andy Kim is given a better shot at re-election if Joe Biden is at the top of that ticket, to your point about preserving or building majorities in the federal legislature?
So ultimately, candidates always still matter, and Andy Kim is a fantastic candidate. He's proven himself to be a thoughtful policy leader and someone who's engaged in the community. So regardless of who's at the top, if you don't have the good candidate in front of you, it sort of doesn't matter. That being said, it's hard for any of us to ignore the demographics of the 3rd Congressional District, speaking of that, with the dichotomy between Burlington and Ocean counties and the people of those respective counties. I think Andy Kim running under Andy Kim running under Vice President Biden puts him in a chance to take one talking point away that his opposition will try and wage against him. Because I think they'll want to spend so much time talking about Senator Sanders' views as opposed to talking about the issues that matter in the 3rd Congressional District. But let me be clear though, if for some reason, if the world were to change, the results of Super Tuesday, the results of last night may say we're moving in one direction. If the world were to change, I'm going to work my heart out for Senator Sanders, and I'm going to work my heart out for Andy Kim. The same way I'm going to work my heart out for Joe Biden, I'm going to work my heart out for Andy Kim and Democrats up and down the ballot in Burlington and beyond. Because this year's race is that important that I don't think we get the luxury of saying, well, I don't have my preferred candidate, so I'm going to take my ball and go home. It matters that much. So I think Andy, though, is uniquely qualified to run an aggressive, well-financed, and thoughtful campaign. And I think having having Vice President Biden at the top of that ticket does put him in a better position to be successful.
Sir, do you think that the establishment of your party has gotten the message in this season that it won't be enough just to get people into office, that they will have to drive, in fact, a progressive agenda on the healthcare front?
I always quibble with the idea of the establishment, right? Because if you look at the votes that happened in South Carolina, Mississippi, Michigan as well, the establishment there looks a lot like me, a lot of black folks. And by no point at any time in our political history have black people been the establishment of anything, right? So I sit there and I only quibble with that because this idea that I think our party has to realize that we're not in these specific buckets, right? We can't be so rigid and think that it's a label of moderate or progressive or ultra progressive or blue dog. Like, we have to move beyond that. What I do think, and nobody can quibble with, Senator Sanders has injected ideas in this campaign and ideas in this race that are permeating in every campaign that we saw. Almost every campaign that ran has some aspects of the narrative that he has forced in this conversation. I think that makes our party better. I think putting healthcare at a forefront has made our party better. I think the conversation around making sure that everyone has a real opportunity at that American dream, I think is something that Senator Sanders has talked about for years, and has injected it into our party. There may be different ideas on how we achieve that, but I think we'd be naive to think that we wouldn't be having these conversations to the level we are if he had not been in this race. And for all of us now who have the responsibility of framing public policy now as we move forward, we can't lose sight of the interjection of those ideals and principles and try and weave them into any public policy we have moving forward.
Slight detour based on something you said. To what extent do you think our tendency to simplify people with labels is hindering the ideas within our public discourse?
I think identity politics is dangerous, period. I think too often we get focused on the people in front of us rather than the ideas and content that they give us. And that's a dangerous, slippery slope for many of us to run down. And I think if you start thinking about the level of discourse in our body politic as it is right now and as it's moving, I think it's indicative of that mindset taking over. So I harken back, and I'm a student of history, so I harken back to the days when we used to have, the word used to be the Rockefeller Republicans and all of these conversations, and the Northeast Republicans, as it were. It's the same way the conversation were about having Southern Democrats at some point. And you think through the mechanics of sort of how we've all evolved and we've all changed. We get to these camps and become so polarized that trying to find consensus gets you vilified on one side or the other, right? You're never in a position to say, let's just have a conversation where I can learn from you and you can learn from me. If nothing else, I want to understand your viewpoint. And if we can do it in a rational, reasonable way, maybe I can convince you that maybe your viewpoint's a little askew and maybe think of another way, or vice versa. But we get so caught up right now in saying that I have to be right and you have to be wrong, that it puts us in a spot that there's no space for reason, rational conversations. And the public policy problems are so big that the only way they're fixed is with reasonable and rational conversation. So for me, there's no other way of trying to govern, at least how I govern myself. There's no other way for me to govern myself than to be in rooms with people who think like me and people who don't think like me and try and engage conversation.
Do you think that we've become more mean-spirited, or do you think that people have become less tough and are not prepared, not civically prepared to undertake the hazards of being in the public square, which is by definition going to put you into contact with people who disagree with you, people who feel fiercely ideologically opposed to you? Or do you feel that social media has just made us a mean-spirited and increasingly irritated and irritable society?
To some degree, all of the above, right? So let's take it by parts. So if you think about it, there are certain districts across our country that you never have to talk to someone that has a different view, because of the way that the district is constructed and gerrymandered in such a way. You really only have to talk to the 51%, even though it's a lot more in some places, 51% of the people who think like you, and convince them to agree with you. And because of that, you never have the opportunity to go sit with someone with an opposing point of view and realize you have to bring them onto your side in order to earn their trust for your election. So our broader construction of districts all across our country, the congressional ones and legislative ones in some area, are a problem. And that's a huge problem, right? Secondarily, I do think social media has played an influence. Governor Christie is famous for saying, and I agree with him 1,000% for this, it's hard to hate up close, but it's easy when you can do it in a computer in your own living room or on your phone, and you got 200 or some odd characters or whatever the number is right now, and can call someone every name in the book and say they're, stupid as dirt, right? People can do that, and they feel comfortable getting away with doing that, when necessarily if they had to sit in front of you, they wouldn't say that, because it's difficult to really hate up close, by and large, for most people. So I think so many of us have to get back to some level of personal contact, which is one of the reasons why since I was an assembly member, probably now 6+ years, going back even longer, we do a monthly citizen advisory panel meeting. Every month, I invite a group of citizens in. Anyone can sign up and come. We don't check registration. We don't check where you live, so it's not just 7th District folks who come. We talk about the issues that we're faced with today. We also talk about things that I'm charged with voting on, or initiatives and ideas and bills that we've come up with. We do this every month. Every month we sit down and folks come in and we just have a free conversation like we would at any diner or any coffee shop amongst neighbors, just talking about the issues we have. And the conversations are fascinating because there's Democrats, there's Republicans, there's liberals, there's conservatives, there's moderates. Everybody's in this room and we're all just talking through stuff. And for me, no matter how much we get in these echo chambers that are Washington or Trenton, that's how I stay grounded, by talking to the people that I work for every month to get their opinion on whatever the issue du jour is. And I think that's helpful. That's what we have to go back to, engaging people and really talking through the challenges we face.
Is that the essence of leadership in a democratic republic, A? And B, do you think that's the main reason why Donald Trump fails? Because he talks to a base that he agrees with. He parses information along the lines of those media delivery systems that either disagree or agree.
I think part of it, though, goes back to your earlier point where you talk about being civically engaged. And I think we have lost sight of truly what being civically engaged means. And so many of our school districts, like we're not actually teaching civics, because to some it's become this idea that you're going to interject your partisan views into teaching civics. And we have a proposal on that, trying to insert civics education in a real concerted and meaningful, impactful way back in our schools. Not to shape anyone's political viewpoint, but to have people think critically about the stuff that's in front of them. Because too often, on the right and the left, people are just regurgitating things they heard from some pundit that has said, whether it was on Fox News, CNN, or MSNBC, and are just regurgitating it without even putting any of their own critical thinking into it. They're like, does that really make sense? And I think for some in our body politic, they're relying on people to not be civically engaged enough, that they're just going to regurgitate something, that if we keep putting something out over and over and over again, they'll just repeat it. And then because they'll repeat it, they interject it into themselves, and then they will become the mouthpieces that move about. That's what happens when we don't embrace our civic responsibility. The biggest part of our representative democracy is not folks like me, it's not Donald Trump, it's not Phil Murphy. It's the average everyday citizen who, by the power of their vote, determines whether or not Troy Singleton sits in this seat, Donald Trump sits in Washington, Phil Murphy sits in Trenton, wherever. And we've become such a society that's become so cynical. And frankly, those of us in government have helped create this cynicism. But we become so cynical that we feel like it doesn't matter. And by us feeling like it doesn't matter, we get poor representation across the board. And I think if we could do anything to try and change that, engage folks to wanting to vote more instead of putting up these roadblocks that we see in some of these states. I was disgusted by the fact that some gentleman in Texas had to wait 7 hours to exercise his constitutional right to vote because they had closed polling places and made it more cumbersome for folks to do that. That stuff they do in dictatorships. That should never happen in the greatest country in the world. We should embrace our right to vote and embrace the fact that we can change the course of public policy and the course of direction of our country on a presidential level every 4 years. And here in New Jersey, there's election for something every year. We can change that course every year. And for us to try and stop people from doing it in any way, we do a disservice to the Constitution I've sworn and upheld to support and defend, every military member who's done it, and each of us who are blessed enough to live in this country.
Sir, that legislation you referenced, the civic education, it would require schools to teach civics as a component of history. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah, and the idea behind it is pretty straightforward. It's like we want you to understand your place in our representative democracy, why you exercising your right to vote matters in our representative democracy, and then what type of things you should use to think through critically to make a decision whether you become a Republican, a Democrat, or independent about how our government should be run. If we do that, if we can inform folks that way, we'll get more people to participate. The more people we participate, the better our democracy is. And I would tell you, any elected official, any politician that wants to keep more people from participating does not deserve to be in elective office. That tells a lot about them. So for us, this whole concept is to start training folks young So we get in the middle school and the high school, so they start understanding it, so that by the time they're 18, they know the awesome responsibility they have and the awesome power they have by just going that first Tuesday in November or in June for a primary or school board election to press a button and make a difference.
You almost obsessively refer to voters, citizens, as your bosses. I've heard it for years.
Right.
Do you believe that we have a boss politics problem in New Jersey, or do we need people who might have gotten into office by only one narrow way to understand that ultimately they have to get out there and engage the voters who truly are the bosses? In other words, we have imperfect forms, but it's incumbent on us to ensure that the system is functioning, and that can only happen if you are engaging real people.
Right. So as I said, we don't have constituents, and we do have bosses, and we say that, and we say it all the time. It's a mantra in which we live by in this office. We have over 226,000 of them in the 7th district. There is not some mysterious person behind a screen who's going to tell me or make a decision in the 7th district whether or not I'm going to be successful or not. Every race I've ever had to run is because I've knocked on doors and talked to the people who I've asked to represent them, the people I work for. And frankly, it's the understanding that the dichotomy of the role is as a public servant, not being a politician. You know, my job is to serve the public, and too many people and all throughout our country who are politicians forget that the citizenry doesn't work for us, we work for them. So I believe wholeheartedly in this idea of being a public servant. So ultimately for me, the people who judge me are not somebody who sits behind a desk somewhere making a decision on who does this and who does that. The people who make the determination on what I do are the people that I go before now as a senator every 4 years, but prior to that, every 2 years in the 7th legislative district. And I can tell you, if those folks don't want me here, they will find a new employee to fill this role as senator. And every time I go humbly before the voters, I know that. And that's why I work so hard in the times that I lead up to those elections to make sure that my bosses recognize that I've been working for them and them solely. They will always make a determination on whether or not what I say is actually what I've done. And I'm willing to live by that discretion and live by that decision of the voters each and every time.
Senator, if we could go back to the affordability question.